museum I worked at, the Corcoran Gallery of Art, where I was the assistant curator of photography at the time. And the photographs in this book were really transformative for me. They were life-changing because I don't think I had ever seen a photographer who worked so unsparingly around a topic that, that is so little represented in the 20th century history of photography. There is, of course, a really rich 19th and early 20th century history of photography of death, but nothing like what Sally's done. In separate projects about the death of some of her dogs, about the Body Farm, a forensic research facility in Tennessee, images from which you're seeing right now, and also in a series of photographs about a convict who escaped onto her property and committed suicide before he was captured by police. And finally, a connected group of 2 different series, images of Civil War battlefields, which are really extraordinary, just animated seemingly by ghosts who make their way in through the incredible process that Sally uses of wet collodion, and images of the faces of her children. These 2 projects conjoined at the end of the show to give people a sense of what comes after death and how we keep carrying forward. And I want to show you just a few images of the exhibition. In some ways, it's a bit painful for me to show these because there's no real way to convey just how beautiful the exhibition looked. Sally said once in a documentary about her that it was as though the galleries had been made for these photographs, and that's pretty much how it felt when we were putting them on the wall. It was as though they really were meant to be there. In the first room, there were images about her dogs. And leading into the second room, many of her wet collodion negatives have been turned into ambrotypes that were incredibly rich and lustrous and showed the bones of some of her dogs. And in the next room, the images from the Body Farm, which were profoundly moving. They were, of course, extremely difficult for a lot of people, but living with them day after day was really transformative for me. And then finally, in the last 2 rooms, a series of the Civil War battlefields led to an almost temple-like room of photographs of her children. But right in the middle of that Civil War battlefield room, there was a river of these ambrotypes leading right to the end. And because I was lucky enough to work with Sally on that, I got a chance to get a sense of her ethos, of her sensibility, and also a real sense of just how thought, how felt, how profoundly important to her were these bodies of work. And it was a real privilege to be able to bring them to an audience. Now, there's always that moment in the introduction where you just have to go through the biographical information. And now's that moment. I'll try to make it quick, Sally. She was born in Lexington, Virginia in 1951. She has received numerous grants and awards, including a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship, and her work is held by major institutions internationally, far too many to name. Her many books include At 12 in 1988, The Highly Influential Immediate Family in 1992, Still Time in 1994, What Remains in 2003, Deep South, a fantastic book of landscapes in 2005, Proud Flesh, about her husband Larry in 2009, and recently a mid-career survey at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts called The Flesh and the Spirit in 2010. A feature documentary about Sally's work called What Remains debuted to critical acclaim in 2006 and is well worth a look if you haven't seen it. Sally's represented by Gagosian Gallery and Edwin Haupt Gallery, both in New York, and as ever, she still lives near Lexington, Virginia. We're very happy to have Sally here with us tonight to do a reading. Please join me in welcoming Sally Mann.
Went just fine without those slides. That's really good. Hi. Thank you. Thank you so much. What we're going to do is we're going to read a little, okay, I'm going to read a little, oh God, I'll never get the hang of this microphone thing. I'm going to read a little from the book, and let me see. Now, you promised you'd put it on. There we go. And then Paul and I will have a chat, and then you guys can just ask any questions you want. I think I'm up for it. I just had a little grilling on your local NPR station. So I think I can take just about anything you can throw out there. So I'm going to just read. My editor picked this out for me, and she did a really good job. But basically, I'm going to read just from the chapters about my childhood and early miscreant teenage years. So it starts. I'm starting with chapter 3, and the title of that chapter is "The Bending Arc." As many people have remarked, I am lucky to have found Larry Mann when I did. Whether I was born this way or my personality was formed by circumstance, I don't think anyone would call me an easy person to deal with. And by the time our paths crossed, the hormones of those teen years had only made things worse. I had been a near feral child, raised not by wolves, but by the 12 boxer dogs my father kept around Boxerwood, the honeysuckle strangled and darkly mysterious 30-acre property where I grew up. The story of my intractability has been told and retold to me all my life by my elders, usually accompanied by a friendly little cheek pinch and a sympathetic glance over at my mother. Recently, in tracking down stories about Virginia Carter, the black woman who worked for my family for nearly 50 years, I visited Jane Alexander, a 96-year-old who repeated to me in a soft voice with a bobby pin twang to it the now familiar tale of my refusal to wear a stitch of clothing until I was 5. Family snapshots seem to bear this out. Maybe we could lower the lights just a little bit. I know that my mother tried to raise me properly, but I made her cross as 2 sticks. And so she turned to the day-to-day care of her stroppy, unruly child over to Virginia, known to everybody as Gigi, a name given her by my eldest brother, Bob. Jane Alexander reminded me about the beautiful, often handmade dresses that Gigi would lovingly press for me in hopes that they would soften my resolve to live as a dog. I have them still, pristine and barely worn. If my early years sound a bit like those legends of wolf-teat sucklers, I guess they were. But all the same, when I compare the lives of children today, monitored, protected, medicated, and overscheduled, to my own unsupervised, dirty, boring childhood, I believe I had the better deal. I grew into the person I am today, for better or worse, on those lifeless summer afternoons, having doggy adventures that took me far from home, where no one had looked for me or missed me in the least. Looking back, though, it could be that my parents were a bit on the less than diligent side, even for the times. Once when I was with my mother in the dry goods section of Leggett's department store, we saw the distinctive going-to-town hat worn by Mrs. Hinton bobbing above the bolts of cloth. She was the mother of my brother Bob's best friend, Billy Hinton. When she saw my mother, she brightened and said, "Oh, Billy just received a postcard from Bob. Apparently he loves his new school." My mother, rubbing some Velveteen between forefinger and thumb, responded distractedly, "Oh, that's good. We hoped he had gotten there okay." Turns out that 10 days before, my parents had packed a steamer trunk full of warm clothes for my 15-year-old brother and driven him to the Lynchburg, Virginia train station. After 8 hours on the Lynchburg train, he had to change stations in New York. My parents told him to carry his trunk from Penn Station to Grand Central, the Vermont boarding school, Grand Central, to locate the overnight train to a town near the Putney School, the Vermont boarding school he was to attend. Then they left him and apparently never wondered if those connections had worked for the boy who had not traveled alone before, or even if he had made it to Putney at all. They had heard nothing since dropping him off and had never called the school to check. My mother told that story countless times, laughing gaily at her recollection of Mrs. Hinton's shock. The assumption back then, in the palmy, post-war Eisenhower years in America, was that everything was fine now, and that was true for the most part. I think my parents were fairly untroubled by child-rearing issues, except for the constant battles over clothing their stubborn hoyden. My father called me Jaybird because I was that naked. But eventually, even that was solved by the arrival in 1956 of Mr. Coffey's carpentry crew, there to build a cottage for my grandmother Jessie on the property. My mother proposed a deal. If I wanted to hang out with the carpenters, I had to wear clothes of some sort. I was so lonely, I took it. Even though I finally agreed to wear clothing, I had some difficulty working out the details, as my mother's exasperated journal entries report. Sally is in a towering rage in her room because I won't let her go to play school with tattered and dirty underpants instead of the clean ones. Her turn to create a ruckus. I'm firm and calm at present, but I'm about to blow up myself. Despite being kicked out several times for not wearing any underwear, never mind tattered and dirty, a few mornings a week I began to attend Mrs. Lackman's preschool, where I worked on my socialization skills. By springtime, I had managed to make some human friends whose parents drove them out to my house for a birthday party presided over by Gigi. By the time I began real school, I was almost normal. I no longer spent my days poking at snapping turtles in the pond or hiding out with my grubby blanket in the honeysuckle caves or following my unneutered beagle on his amorous adventures down the paved road from which, when I was hungry, I would pull stringy hot tar to chew like gum. I now wore crinolines, little white socks, and gauzy dresses. So there's a gap here, and we're now in my miscreant teenage years. On the weekends, I would head off with my date in his Chevelle or El Camino, my hair rat's nested and lacquered into ringlets atop my heavily made-up face, eyelashes curled and matted with mascara, heavy black lines drawn across and well past my eyelid in a Cher-like Cleopatra imitation, lips shiny with cheap lipstick, jungle gardenia flowering at my throat, on my wrists, and between my A-cup breasts, which did their best to swell out of a padded bra. I would generally heave in pretty close to my absolute curfew so as not to enrage my punctilious father unduly, and find my parents serenely sitting on the couch in the living room. My mother, with her stockinged legs tucked beneath her, would be wreathed in blue cigarette smoke, deep in the New York Times or Harper's. My father, a well-sharpened yellow pencil in hand, would be reading with pointy intensity some scholarly paper or plant catalog from the Far East and wouldn't deign to raise his eyes. Stripping off her reading glasses, my mother would squint through the smoke at me with vague confusion, as though an unexpected stranger had just appeared. Weaving slightly, I would stand not in front of them but off to the side, as if eager to head down the hall to my bedroom to get some last-minute studying done. My hair, trailing bobby pins, would be matted and tendrilled against my hickey-spotted neck, and the skirt of my dress would be wrinkled, the taupe toes of pantyhose peeking out from my purse. My swollen lips were now a natural chapped red, and my cheeks blushed with beard burn. Peering over the angry marks on either side of her nose left by her glasses, my mother, studying the stone fireplace 4 feet behind me, would ask casually, "Oh, did you have a nice time, dear?" Really, what choice did they have but to send me away to school? My brothers, 9 and 7 years older than me, were hectoring them to send me to Putney, which they both attended and loved. Even I knew, on some level, that I needed to get out of the high school world, whose horizon stopped at cheerleader tryouts and drag races on the bypass. Ray Goodlatte, the admissions director at Putney, must have waived a few of their policies to get me in. In a pattern that has remained constant all my life, my verbal scores were in the 99th percentile, but oh God, were my math scores abysmal. And my high school grades were only so-so, not always on the honor roll anymore. Most of the kids at Putney were sophisticated children of urban intellectuals with good scores and good grades, fewer than 20% from below the Mason-Dixon line. Not one would have known, as I did, what a whomping a 4-on-the-floor GTO could give a Barracuda in the quarter mile on the bypass. So in September of 1967, my mother packed me in my brass-cornered trunk, the same one that my brother Bob had lugged from station to station in New York, into her powder blue Rambler station wagon, and we set off for Vermont. Halfway there, the car blew a head gasket and died, so we rented a much newer car. In it, as we pulled up to White Cottage, my new dorm, I unknowingly enjoyed the last moment of personal confidence I was to feel for a long time. The first week, I raised my hand in Hepper Caldwell's history class and asked what a Jew was. Hepper, we were allowed to call our teachers by their first names, though startled, refrained from making fun of me, but no such luck from the rest of the class, many of whom were Jews. I was the most ridiculed minority of all, a dumb cracker with a trunk full of very uncool, reversible wraparound skirts my mother had sewn herself, Clark's desert boots with crepe soles from Talbot's, and variably sized pink foam hair rollers. Nobody at Putney had hydrogen peroxide blonde hair teased into a beehive. Nobody at Putney wore makeup, and nobody at Putney listened to the Righteous Brothers or wore her boyfriend's leather sweater and heavy class ring, its band wrapped with dirty adhesive tape. So we're going to skip ahead to chapter 4, the family of Mann. After Putney, and a wayward summer writing poetry and taking pictures in Mexico, I enrolled at Bennington College, figuring it would be pretty much the same as Putney, 48 miles away. I wasn't any fonder of being way up north, but it was a known quantity, as opposed to Sarah Lawrence or Barnard, schools that I decided were too urban for me. Flying the familiar route on Piedmont Airlines to tiny Weirs Cave Airport, I arrived home for Christmas in 1969 and finally met Larry 3 months after our destiny, unbeknownst to us, had been sealed on the afternoon he moved the epic stone. You'll have to read the book to get that story. The farmhouse where my Lexington boyfriend lived had an odd layout, and one night as I slouched in a satanically bad mood on the edge of his bed, Larry walked through the room to the shared bathroom. I had no idea who he was. He did not so much as glance in my direction, but my eyes followed him with a warm, glittering interest. We were married 6 months later. You'd never know it by looking at the parents' allocation of resources and time, but there were 2 sons in the Mann family, Larry and Chad, 2 years younger. The Manns had chosen to concentrate their efforts on Larry, probably because of his exceptional good looks, tractability, and general social ease. Directly inside the front door of their home was a large, gilt-framed painting of Larry the equestrian, executed in the fawning style of an Ancien Regime court artist. Nowhere in the house was there any sign that there was another child in the family. No pictures or trophies or framed diplomas. Chad also came in for physical abuse by his mother, but he surmises that because he wore glasses, he didn't get the hard facial slaps that sent Larry to school with his ears ringing and reddened, and instead got just the spoon and the brush. Except for the beatings, Chad was basically ignored, which in a way was a blessing. The Manns zeroed in on the horse world as the best place to show off their handsome son and to make contacts with the right kind of people. Every afternoon after school, Larry was picked up by his mother in a Mustang convertible, her bouffant covered by an Hermes scarf, and driven to Ox Ridge Hunt Club for intensive lessons in dressage and jumping by their top instructors. In fact, he loved horses and riding, even ring work in the fancy horse shows. Like me, he found time on a horse transcendent and healing in some way, but especially in the less structured disciplines, playing polo, fox hunting, or occasionally just galloping on the cinder paths that lined the fields. While his mother drank martinis at the club bar, Larry hung out with the forbidden groom underclass and realized all the more clearly the trap into which he had been born. But even into his late teens, he remained pliant, escorting the daughters of the rich to balls at the Ritz, while, with the avidity of a Spanish conqueror seeking Inca gold, his mother scoured the hunt clubs and society pages for just the right wealthy daughter-in-law. The girl Larry brought home in spring 1970 was far from meeting any of their criteria. "She goes to Bennington?" they asked incredulously, responding to the news of our romance as if he had found me in a leper colony outside Baton Rouge. Implacably, Larry said yes. Bending to his unexpected defiance, they offered a grudging invitation for me to visit. When Larry and I arrived over Easter, his mother placed a Lilly Pulitzer outfit on the bed in my room as an alternative to my 501s and Frye boots. I decided right there that she was a ring-tailed yard bitch. The feeling was clearly mutual. At the midday Easter dinner, when we announced we were going to get married in 6 weeks, his parents and grandparents burst into tears and left the table. We looked over at Chad, who raised an eyebrow and smiled, then spooning mint jelly onto his plate, continued eating. We did the same, and that night, Larry crossed from his bedroom to mine, and we made noisy love before leaving at dawn. We found out later that after that week, his parents made an appointment with their lawyer to cut Larry out of their will. Their disapproval only increased our determination and the perverse pleasure we took in our unacceptable love. The preparations for the wedding were easy. We bought 2 simple gold rings at Ed Levin's shop in Bennington, and I designed a demure cotton dress that I had a local seamstress stitch up. My father dusted off his Linhof and shot a few pictures, one of which Larry's parents grudgingly put in the New Canaan newspaper. So now we'll skip ahead, maybe just a year or so. I had a vision of how I wanted to live. In 1969, my parents and I had visited Helen and Scott Nearing on their subsistence farm in Maine, and I had made a heavily underscored mental note that this was exactly what I wanted for myself. A life of simplicity, pluck, seclusion, and soul-satisfying ecological sweat-of-the-brow will vote with our lives self-sufficiency. 7 years later, Larry and I were giving it a go. By 1977, we were digging by hand the footers for an impossibly perilous cliff dwelling, and then for the next half-decade, we scavenged building materials for it, learning as we went. By the time Cy moved back to Lexington, this is the chapter on Cy Twombly, the painter who some of you may know. By the time Cy moved back to Lexington in 1993, the resultant spindly, hand-built, Rube Goldberg-like passive solar house had bulked up with a succession of shed-roofed add-ons, living areas cantilevered out over the abyss, and labyrinthine porches covered with vines. A commercial pilot we know once remarked that from the air, our house resembled those shanty towns on the edge of the Mexico City dump. And we were not offended. It was a totally cool, Big Surish house, impractical, whimsical, not to code in any respect, the kind of place that stopped passers-by in their tracks and lured them, cautious and curious, past the basilisk sculptures to our slab-wood front door. Cy, too, would wander down from the warehouse to that door, calling out in his distinctive, hesitant voice, "Sally, are you receiving?" We both liked to sit out on the wisteria-covered back deck overlooking the creek, especially on those sultry summer nights when the fog rose from the bottomland and wisped among the racemes of white bloom. One such night found a group of us with Cy and Nicola, his gentle, erudite companion, sitting after a late dinner on that porch, the newspaper-covered table nacreous with oyster shells, bottles of wine darkening the center. I mentioned my past fascination with Ezra Pound, an American who, like Cy, had found Italy his place, quote, for starting things, and about whom I had written my master's thesis. At this, Cy, sitting to my right at the head of the table, leaned over to me with a look of a confidence about to be divulged, so I pressed close. When Cy was about to tell a story or make a naughty quip, he would cover his mouth in a schoolchild's way, fingertips lightly touching his primly pursed lips, while above them the eyes were alight and impish. I watched memory veil those eyes as he spoke of a time in the late 1960s when he and Nicola had been invited to the Spoleto Festival by its founder, Giancarlo Menotti. That evening, a Russian pianist was performing, and Menotti honored Cy and Nicola by seating them in his private balcony in the Opera Theater. As they took their seats, they were startled to see behind them Ezra Pound and Olga Rudge, one of the three women with whom Pound had simultaneous relationships. Cy described Pound as having an aura, a mystical appearance, and as being somehow set apart from regular people. Nicola wrote me later that Pound, quote, acted extremely shy, like only a northern blonde child could be. He hardly looked at us, and in a side way. Telling me of this in the humid summer night, Cy emphasized how rare it was to see the reclusive poet, who seldom appeared in public in those later years. Pound had been driven mad, or perhaps more mad, by his wartime incarceration in Pisa for treason. It was there, locked up like an animal in a 6 by 6.5 foot wire cage, that he began writing on a piece of toilet paper the uneven but brilliant Pisan cantos. Interestingly, housed in the cage next to him was Emmett Till's father, Lewis, until he was hanged, quote, for murder and rape with trimmings, as Pound put it. After Pound began to show clear signs of a mental breakdown, he was shipped from Pisa back to the United States and confined to the bug house at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. A decade after his release in 1958, Pound stopped speaking altogether. Much was made of his self-imposed silence, and it has always been reported that not a single word ever passed his lips once he began it. Except, to their amazement, Cy and Nicola heard Pound speak to Olga. They both described it as the whispering of a deeply wounded and suspicious man, but also of a man fading out of this life. Cy said he would have loved to have exchanged just one word with this intransigent, mysterious, wrong-headed, brilliant man. Instead, he and Nicola somehow maintained a posture of intense interest in the music played before them, arching backwards in their seats, hoping to hear the thoughts of a genius. Imagine that, on my peckerwood porch, late in the humid, cloyingly fragrant Virginia night, Cy, in a Pound-like whisper, tells a story I found marvelous in the many improbable threads it wove together. That he had seen, had heard Ezra Pound, the author of the lines written on my father's memorial stone, with whom I held a long fascination, and that within this tale was another of my long-held fascinations, Emmett Till. And of course that the storyteller was Cy, the local hero, come back to sit in the dung-heap-turned garden that was our home, the prodigal returning to Lexington. So, thank you. Thanks. I hope that wasn't too choppy. It sort of jumped ahead and maybe there were some unexplained moments, but. So which seat did we decide on?
I'm left, you're right.
Okay, good. All right. Now I want you to know where I was last night. We had water bottles that Ann Patchett filled with gin. Actually, she gave them to everybody but me, which I thought was a little unfair, but okay. But these seem to be the real thing.
No, the real thing. I feel kind of inadequate now.
The unreal thing. Water. Water.
Can we get the projector turned off? That was fantastic. Thank you. it confirms something that I've been thinking about while I was reading it. I don't see you very often, but when I was reading it, what I loved about it, other than the stories and some other things that we'll talk about, was your language, because I felt like I was listening to you. You know, it sounded exactly like you, and that really confirmed it for me. But it's so much more than that. It's so beautifully written. It is, it's sly, it's really descriptive. Your love for archaisms and metaphor come through, which is pretty wonderful. And the timbre and pitch of words in combination, it's very musical. And it reminded me that for many, many years, before even we worked on What Remains, I always thought you were a great writer for a photographer, you know? You wrote these...
Let's qualify that, right?
I have to qualify it. You know, I would read your books, and you would write these amazing introductions. And I thought, wow, those are really great. But they were short. I mean, and inevitably, right? They were really short.
Yeah.
And you have a background in English literature, which you just outlined for people. But you've never written anything at this length before, right?
No, God, no. Are you kidding? It took me 5 years to write this.
5 years. Unbelievable. How did you start something like this? Did you have any writers in mind? Were there any memoirs that inspired you? Or did you just wake up every day and get going?
I tell you what I didn't read. Well, I just read, and I hope everyone in this room rushes out and buys this and reads it. But after I finished writing it, just in the last couple of months, I read the book called Speak Memory. And I thought, thank God I didn't read that before. I tried to write this one because it's just so brilliant. But no, I didn't read anybody's memoirs. I mean, you know the story about how it started because of that Massey lecture thing. Right. So Harvard University does a series of lectures, and they're very prestigious, and I've always just thought, you know, they were just beyond the pale, certainly beyond my pale, called the Massey Lectures in American Civilization. And I was asked to deliver them, and when I got the letter, I mean, I looked at the envelope, I looked at the letter, I thought it must be misaddressed, I thought it must be some mistake. How in the world, why would they ask a photographer to deliver these really scholarly academic lectures? I mean, Eudora Welty delivered hers, and it turned into the great book, One Writer's Beginning, I think it's called. Anyway, so I thought it was a complete mistake. And then I called them, and they said, no, we want you. And then, of course, that sent me into a spasm of, like, self-doubt and fear and anxiety. And, you know, I spent a year hand-wringing over whether I even say yes. And then I said yes, and then I started writing. And, you know, and the way it started, and Kaz, who is a student here at Ryerson, she knows how this is at our house. When you sit at the dinner table, you've had a couple of drinks, you're talking, and there's always a couple of stories that you end up telling. And I always had some good stories, like, you know, 5 or 6 good stories. You have a couple of drinks and you start telling these crazy stories about your family. And I realized that really this book could just be a concatenation of all those crazy stories about my crazy family. And I didn't know the half of it, because then I went upstairs and I opened up all the boxes, and then I realized how truly crazy my family was. Yeah, then I knew I had some Gothic in there.
You have always been a storyteller, but I'm guessing that it wasn't like Bill Christenberry. Now, with Bill Christenberry, he, for years, was begged by various people to do a book of his stories. And he's such a fantastic storyteller.
Did he do it?
Well, he finally did, yeah.
Oh,
I don't know anybody who's read it.
But yeah, well, I haven't read
fantastic.
it, and I'm a big fan of his work.
But did you get asked through the years to write a memoir by people who knew some of the amazing stories in your background?
No, I don't think so. I don't remember it.
It was really just that one precipitating event?
Well, who could say no to an invitation like that? It was, I mean, it was the greatest honor that had ever been bestowed on me, and it was absolutely the most terrifying thing. That letter, I mean, my hands were shaking when I read it, and I just was convinced I couldn't do it. I was just paralyzed by fear. But yeah, once I got started, it's like Hemingway in A Movable Feast. He says, just write one true sentence. When you can't get started, and this is true with photography too. I mean, I assume some of you are photographers in here. And when you run out of ideas and you can't think of what you're going to take a picture of, and you think that the well is run dry and all that kind of, you know, stuff that your brain tells you, what Hemingway wrote was, he said, write the one true sentence that you know. And he said, just when you find that one true sentence, take out all the scroll work. I love that term. Take out all the scroll work and write the one true sentence. And that's how I started. I sat on the computer and I just started telling the stories.
One of the things you say in the book that I found interesting, you kind of openly acknowledge it, is that as you were in the attic looking through the boxes and kind of unlocking these stories, reading these old letters that you didn't even know existed,
right.
Or reading journals from your parents, you actually then went out and followed up on some of the stories. You did research. You got in touch with people from the past.
Yeah.
What was that like? What was that process like? Were people generally helpful?
Yeah, and what's interesting about that, I was talking to Ann Patchett about it, and she said, it just seems so different, the idea of you being a detective and actually trying to delve into, in a very kind of almost scientific way.
Yeah.
It seems so different from that sort of intuitive way that you write, but it's not unlike taking a portrait. I called up some people who were in their 80s who hadn't talked about very sensitive subjects. When you read the book, you'll know what I'm talking about. And I asked them very sensitive questions, and it was psychology. It was just like taking a portrait. You just have to convince them that you're honest and you're for real and you're not going to hurt them, or you're trying not to hurt them. And portraits often hurt people. We'll get into that later, maybe, but. Yeah, no, it's psychology. It was just like taking a portrait. You just sort of had to try and read them.
Yeah. Another thing that you say in the book that I found really fascinating, and at first it kind of shook me up, I have to be honest, because it was a question about photography. You posit in the book that, and it's right at the outset, you say it in your first chapter, that photography and memory are unreliable guides to the truth. And you argue over time in the book that photography, more often than not, and for you in particular, it actually impedes memory rather than aids your memory. And for me, this is one of the more novel, it's a very simple idea, but for some reason I had never quite thought about it that way. And so I felt a bit scandalized by it. The medium that I had always trusted to be the place where my memories live was in fact, in many ways, probably causing me to forget, or causing me to misremember, maybe is more to the point. And I can't get this out of my head now. Thank you very much.
I've ruined them for you, haven't I?
Right.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, did you actually think about that while you were trying to remember the stories that you're putting into the book, or is that something that you've realized for a long time?
No, that's a little bit of both. I've been really deeply suspicious about photography for a long time. But particularly about, I sort of divide photography up between, art photography, which we know the mendacity of art photography. Any of you who are trying to do it, it all. I mean, it's mendacious right at its core. But snapshot photography always has just a little intimation of veracity, of truth, right? That this is unvarnished truth. Not so. And also, not only are those snapshot photographs, of which I have thousands, and all of you do too, and probably more now than ever, they're not the unvarnished truth, and I'll posit that they actually impoverish your memory, that the images that they show rob your memory of other sensory aspects. It's the opposite of the Madeleine, in Proust. It is, you lose all the sensory, you lose the smell and the touch and the feel and all those corollary aspects of memory.
Yeah, it's kind of an amazing thought. I had thought about the lying behind snapshots before. Richard Avedon has that amazing story called Borrowed Dogs, where he talks about once his family lost their fortune. Every year around Christmas, they would pose with someone else's car, a rich friend, with someone else's dog in front of somebody else's mansion, just so that they could send pictures out that would make people think, oh, everything's fine with the Avedons. And so that I had taken to heart, but this idea that actually we we look at the photographs and that the photographs change our understanding of our own past to such an extent that we then have trouble really remembering what happened. That's pretty earth-shaking.
Although it may not be that way for everybody. I don't know about you guys, but so I was talking to Malcolm Jones. You know Malcolm Jones, right? He's a book critic, and he's really, really smart. And he said, no, that's not how it is for me. And he said he has a little snapshot of himself, and he's wearing these great big, he called them brogans, right? No one uses that word anymore, but that's, and it's a very rich word. He's wearing these brogans that the way he describes them, they sound like he's wearing like violin cases on his feet or something. And he said that when he looks at that picture, he can remember exactly the smell of those shoes and the feel of the leather and the blisters that they put on his heels and how he was made fun of and all this kind of stuff. And I'm thinking, well, and Ann Patchett said the same thing yesterday. She said that when she looks at a snapshot, she can remember the stuff that went before the snapshot and the stuff that went. Have I done something bad by? What is that noise?
I don't know.
I'm sure that's my fault from slapping myself. She can remember everything to either side of the picture vividly, like it's just a still in a film. And I'm not like that. I look at the picture and suddenly I don't remember anything. But, I mean, I don't even remember the picture. I don't remember the scene of the picture. I just remember the photograph.
And
I just think that's really subversive and insidious.
It really is, but despite that, as all of you are about to find out, or maybe you already have found out if you go through your book, you tell the stories of your past by weaving together images and pictures in a way that for me was really kind of new. It was something that I had never really thought about before, that you would punctuate a thought with an illustration, but then the illustration would inflect what you see next in a really interesting way. And beyond that, that kind of, over time, as I was looking at the book and reading it and looking and reading, I started to get a sense that the way that you were telling the story was in many ways how I imagine any photographer thinks in a kind of an emblematic way. You were, for example, talking about your own past in various moments, but for the most part, you're looking at yourself through the stories of others, whether these are your children, your parents, your mother and your father, your husband Larry's family, Cy Twombly, your nanny Gigi. And the thing is that the image of you emerges from the details of others. And that's not unprecedented. And it's particularly, I think, a posit with photographers. Photographers are always telling a story about themselves by what they look at through their camera. And for me, that was
really an interesting way of looking at it.
It struck me about 3/4 of the way through. I was a little bit slow to it, but...
I'm really slow to it because I had never quite thought of it that way.
I found it really interesting. Even the way that you described things was almost like Malcolm that you've just described, describing in detail a thing in history as though it were depicted. And then, of course, a picture shows up to really illustrate it for us. So that wasn't something that you were conscious of doing. How did photography and writing relate for you then? How did you end up deciding to put them together in the book in the way that you did? You know, not a separate illustration section, but like a river.
First of all, just to circle back on, as you were talking, I realized that when people would say, so what are you up to these days? I would say, well, I'm writing this book, and it's going to be marketed as a memoir, but I don't like memoirs, and blah, blah, blah. And they said, oh, so it's all about you? And I would say, no, it's really not all about me. And in a certain way, the way I wanted to tell it was about all those other people that you just named. And if that wanted to reflect something of, if that wanted to give people information about me and the telling about other people, that was fine. But there's nothing, I just think there's nothing more hubristic and solipsistic than writing a memoir. So I really didn't want it to be about me, although what I read just now was about me, but so. But I mean, the simplest and most banal answer to that question is that it's basically just a glorified, PowerPoint show. I would give these slideshows to. In fact, I came to Ryerson and gave one years ago, and it would just have pictures, and I would talk, and so I just wrote the book in the same way that those PowerPoints.
That's simple.
But what he's not saying here is how amazing it is that any publisher would be willing to do it. Because no book has, according to my publisher, and maybe they're just tooting their horn, but no book has ever been done like this before. And the reason is, of course, financial, because the way it usually works is you've got a book, and then at the center of the book you have all the shiny paper where all the pictures. And if you're like me, you go right to the pictures, even though you have no idea what the pictures are relating to, right? Right. But that's how it's usually done, and it's never been done this way before. They're very proud of this, and rightfully so, and it was complicated because you had to find the right, this is probably not what you want to talk about tonight, but we had to find the right paper that would work well with type and photographs. Because oddly enough, really nice shiny photo paper, it doesn't work well with words. Letters just don't sit on it right. So we had to find, and we had to order it like a year and a half in advance, and it had to be made specially for this book. So we're really, really lucky, I'm really lucky, and I hope you feel lucky too, that I had such a great publisher that was willing to go to those lengths to do such a beautiful book.
One of the things that interested me as your arrival drew nearer was the extent to which people in the media still want to talk about immediate family.
Oh, for God's sake, it's the truth. Oh, God.
And not in the way you would want them to talk about it, not in the way that...
Right.
And it kind of took me back to when we worked on the show together, because the
same thing happened when we worked on that show.
Exactly, the same thing happened, and it was such a disappointment in a way. We spent, well, maybe, I don't know, I mean, I'm assuming you've gotten questions about it over the years, and I'm assuming you've gotten questions about it in the last few days. But it's a very strange phenomenon to me that these pictures, which I just revisited in the book, in the first edition of the book, for the first time in a while. I mean, the pictures in many ways are in my head all the time, but it's been a while since I went back and looked at the book.
Right.
And it's hard now to remember what the fuss was all about. And I know in a way what the fuss was all about, obviously, but when I look at them now, it seems ever more clear to me that there's a kind of a tension in them that people, I guess, can't really deal with, which is that the pictures are light on the one hand and heavy on the other, that they're about childhood and they're about adulthood, that they balance humor and grace, which I guess makes people uncomfortable, and that they're dealing with these kind of primal and important matters, but through the scrim of what seem to be real scenes that are also a bit fantastic, a bit extraordinary. There's this idyll in them. And I'm curious whether that's something that bedevils you still. I mean, the pictures are extraordinary. There's no way they would have drawn that kind of attention if they weren't as great as they were. And yet, that's not the conversation that you have.
No. It's just astounding I'm still having it.
Yeah.
You know, I almost, so I did this Fresh Air interview a week or so ago with Terry Gross, and she lit into me with this martinet intensity and just hectored me constantly, nonstop, like a terrier, would not let go about whether I had eroticized my children. And I haven't listened to it myself, but I think I didn't lose my temper. I'm not entirely sure. I know there was probably a little sliver of pissed off in my voice. Because I cannot believe that 25 years later we're still, you know, the youngest child is 30 years old.
Right.
I mean, are we really still talking about this?
Yeah.
I've written a 500-page book, and there's 60 pages in the book about the family pictures, and that's all. And your whoever that woman was today did the same thing. That's all she wanted to talk about was the family pictures. Yeah. You know, and you know, maybe I'm complimented that they're still so important, but to still be like chewing on that same bone of whether or not, you know, I mean, I will acknowledge, and we can talk about the whole question of whether or not what is the most valid question to me is whether or not the children could have consented. That question is still, you know, up for grabs, I think. Right. You know, they did, and they're fine with it. Yes, they're fine with it. But the whole sort of the way people just want to keep worrying at that particular bone, just
particularly with the influence that it's had. which for me is a really profound question. There's so many people who have come after your work and who have made work about children and never faced these questions. And, you know, I think I had hoped going into this that it was over, that it was gone. But I guess, you know, you're the locust for that. So, but it's such a shame. And we did experience a similar thing with What Remains. There was, I can go ahead and name her, I guess, a writer named Sarah Boxer.
Oh, I got a story to tell you about her. Did I send you that email? Did I tell you what happened?
A recent thing?
Yeah.
No.
Okay. All right. Okay, we're just going to take a little break here and have a little chat for a second. Okay, you tell the Sarah Boxer story, and then I'll tell you the story.
She wrote, I think it was for the Times, right? It was
yes,
for the
it was for the,
Times.
oh God, it's burned into my memory.
Yeah. It was an awful day.
Oh, it was a terrible review.
It was so awful. It was a blatant attack on your what she perceived as your morbidity, your obsessional kind of. I mean, it was so strange. The details are a little bit hazy to me right now.
It was sui generis. I mean, it was not sui generis.
It was kind of about
ad hominem. I knew it was
ad hominem. It was not about the show. It was like she walked in and completely attacked what she saw as like a massive demonstration of prurience and outlandish behavior.
She said that the dead bodies were gross, and she was so uncomfortable with the whole thing. But it was in a nastier way than that.
Yeah, it was very peculiar. It was not a surprise to any of us that the show would be difficult for some people. I think we all understood that. There is something I feel safe about saying now, which you'll maybe remember or maybe won't, which is that for a brief little moment, it looked like the director was going to kill the show. And it was really out of nowhere for us because we felt, I mean, we had to get the show on the books without any funding at all. And that's not that easy to do, but somehow we were able to do that, and so we thought the director was committed to it. But then at a certain point, somebody said something to him. I don't know what. Somebody, board member or whatever, said something to him.
Those pictures of the children.
Exactly, or whatever, exactly.
That was it.
Exactly. And then he decided to kill it, and I found out about it from the PR
sure
person.
I knew this.
The marketing.
Did you ever tell me this?
Yeah, I did tell you back then. Yeah.
All right, okay.
Well, the whole thing was over in about half a day because the marketing, see, this is the Corcoran Gallery of Art we're talking about, and that's important information here. So about something like an hour or two after he said it to the marketing person, and she ran from his office, came to my office and said, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, he's about to try to kill Sally Show, he's about to try. And then I went and I told Philip, and you know Philip, he just reacted as though nothing had occurred, and he was very calm.
Right.
And then the PR person had the brilliant idea of going back to his office, and she actually said, don't worry about it, I'll take care of it. She goes back to his office and stomps in and says, David, I have one word for you, Mapplethorpe.
Oh, right. And you're going to have to tell this audience about Mapplethorpe.
You guys know that in 1989, the Corcoran canceled the Mapplethorpe exhibition, A Perfect Moment, which was on tour and planned to come to the Corcoran. And it was one of the most.
Was her name Sarah Orr?
No, Christina Orr.
Christina Orr Cahal.
Yeah, these people are all retired, so it's fine.
Yeah. Well, so she has to take responsibility for what she did.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But anyway, they basically the Corcoran lost its board, lost its donor base, lost everything after 1989. Yep. And the director just sat there, stared into the middle distance. That word echoed in his head, and he said, "Okay." And that was it. And she came rushing back to our office and said, "Crisis averted."
Yeah.
I only told you because I thought it was pretty funny.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe I'd forgotten that.
Probably best to block some things out from your mind.
Yeah.
But anyway, the thing about that show that was interesting to us was that it was so beautiful. It was so beautiful. And when we walked into the show, and obviously we were all very biased, but I mean, you were right in a factual way. Those rooms were made for those pictures, particularly for the last two rooms, and also really for the body farm images, which sat beautifully in there. And because it was about the Civil War in many ways, and about the relationship of the present to the Civil War, having it in Washington, generically speaking, was also very powerful. Yeah. So for us, we walked out of the room once it was open, and the opening, which was fantastic and very well attended, and we walked out very, very proud and happy
buoyed
and
up.
pleased.
Oh yeah.
And then
so
when and many of the reviews were good. And so
Yeah.
Sarah Boxer's it was like a shock. It was an absolute shock to us. And in many ways, the only thing that I can say positively about that review before you tell your story is that it made me go into the room almost every day after that to look at those pictures and to feel them the way that I knew that they felt.
Right.
And not the way that she described them, which was, you know.
Oh, it was, yeah.
No.
Oh, it was, and I don't know if y'all think that when you're an artist and you get a bad review, that it just, that it doesn't, did I just, okay, hang on, what have I done now? Jesus. that it doesn't hurt, or that you're just, you just let it wash over you. You don't. It was devastating. Devastating. Just bawling in my chair reading it, and just fists all balled up in rage and anger. I look like that Deanne Arbus photograph of that kid in Central Park. It was just, and I start out at kind of a disadvantage because I operate at such a low confidence level as it is, that I mean, I don't think I take good pictures. I think that every picture is a terrible dodo of a picture, and the next one is going to be an even worse dodo of a picture. And I'm always feeling I'm just sort of reeling from botch to botch. And that's how I think. I'm just like incredibly insecure. And then you get a review like that, and it's a physical kick to the stomach. I mean, I was sick when I read that review. I don't know if other artists are like that. Cy would never read his reviews. I think he took them, and okay, we'll talk just for a second about Cy Twombly, just one of the greatest painters in history, in the world. And he, in the 50s and 60s, he was completely ridiculed and humiliated in America. And I know this because my father saved the reviews in a little folder. And they are awful. Some of them are awful. They're painful to read. They're painful to read because I loved him as a person, but they're painful to read because he's such a fucking great artist. And how could anyone write this kind of humiliating, insulting, belittling stuff about Cy Twombly in the 60s? And I'm telling you, those reviews hurt his feelings. They hurt him, and he remained hurt about them and would make little comments about either the reviewer or the institution that had snubbed him. He was sensitive to that. So I know I'm not alone in this, but I think of every other artist as being completely cool and completely able to deal with criticism, and I'm sure nobody else would get bothered like me. Nobody would be crying over a review, but I was. And it's just really hard putting yourself out there and getting bad reviews. And it's like all the reviews on this book, 99.9% of them have been like glowing reviews, but the one little clause, I can still quote for you the one little niggling complaint that one reviewer wrote. Those are the things I remember. I don't remember all the great things. I mean, yeah.
So tell me about Sarah Boxer. What
oh,
happened?
God. No, this is like live podcast and everything,
That's
right?
true.
Yeah, I'll tell you afterwards. Okay. But it's good.
It's good?
Okay, well, okay, now, I'll tell you. Okay, so Sarah... So I'd never met her. She'd caused me so much pain. Just take it from me. It was really difficult to get that review, and it was hard for you, too. I mean, we put so much in this show. And so her name was like anathema to me, and I just prayed I'd never run into her. So the other night at the National Gallery, they had that. I was at a dinner party, and I walked in, and Susan Mysalis was there, and big hug, hello, Susan, da da da, and she said, oh, "There's someone who really wants to meet you," and it's Sarah Boxer, and she comes over and she says, wow. "I just want you to know you are the new Nabokov." She said that, I swear to God, those very words, and you can put it on the damn live cast. Wow. That's what she said, and I almost fainted. Wow. I thought, well, and here's what I think she might have meant. She said, you should have written that all along, which is sort of like saying, you should have just skipped the photography and not done the writing. I don't know, but I have to say, it felt really good to have her say something nice to me instead of something really
lovely.
mean. It was
Nice
lovely.
validation after
Oh my
all
God,
that.
he's my
Yeah.
favorite writer ever.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
he's my complete hero. So that was a very, very nice thing to say. So thank you, Sarah. My stomach is hurting a little less.
One of your great subjects, obviously, is the American South. And I want to read a couple of sentences that didn't make it into your reading tonight from your book, which is a little weird, I know, because you wrote them, but I'll read them.
Okay.
And then I want to ask you a question. And this is about your place in Southern artistic tradition. One of the quotes is, "Southern artists are known for their susceptibility to myth and their obsession with place, family, death, and the past." And another thing that you write is, "What snake venom is to snake handlers, romance is to the Southern artist. A terrible risk, but also a ticket to transcendence."
Isn't that the greatest line ever? I love
I'm sorry,
that.
I had to pull it out. I had to pull it out.
Isn't that great? What snake venom is to the snake handlers. It's not mine. It came from a Canadian, as a matter of fact.
Oh, did?
Yeah, Neil Mackenzie, my good friend Neil Mackenzie said that. Don't I credit him with that?
You
I think I
probably do, and I forgot.
Yeah, I would.
And then I credit it.
I've tried to steal it in the past, and I realized in this book, my Canadian friend Neil Mackenzie gave me that line.
That's wonderful.
It's just great.
And your landscapes in particular exist on that kind of line of tension. They have this incredible lyricism and yet this really present consciousness of the past and everything that led to the present moment. They're really ambivalent pictures. And they're very, very romantic in their making, too, which I think is really interesting. Maybe not so romantic when it's,
I was going to say.
yeah, when it's 95 degrees
there.
and that high humidity. But
right.
wet collodion, for those of you who don't know, is an extraordinary 19th century process that you use in a way that I've never seen anyone use it, which is that you embrace its, you embrace the risk of futility. It's almost, again, like the snake. I mean, it could go either way.
Right.
And so the images seem to show both what you see and also an overlay of larger issues, an overlay of the past of that particular place. And they are landscapes like no others that I know. And so I have a question, which is that place is important to you, but it's important in a way that I think it isn't to other landscape photographers necessarily. It's like a referent to something else. And I wonder if you can talk about that a bit. When you're in a place, what are you thinking of?
Well, you know, I took landscapes, and the book kind of outlines this really early in my career. That was those are the first pictures I took when my father handed me my first camera. I drove around Rockbridge County where I live, and I took pictures of the places that I loved. It was as simple as that. And then I went off and did, 12-year-olds and the family pictures, and then the siren song of landscape started calling me in just the most extraordinary way, as only like a new lover can call, seducing you away from. So he was seducing me away from the family pictures. And the way it happened was I was driving around. I took the Suburban loaded up with all my equipment and a wet plate darkroom in the back and all that kind of stuff. And I was driving around the South, and and here's the weirdest detail. I was listening to Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which of all things to be listening to, right? But I kept feeling very, very, very clearly the spirits of the. In the case of the Deep South pictures, the spirits of the African American slaves that had completely transformed that landscape, particularly Mississippi. I don't know if any of you have been to the Delta, but the Mississippi Delta, which, picture it in your head, rows and rows of cotton fields, long. No, it used to be nothing but forest. And the slaves completely, they dug up all those trees, they dug out all the roots, they turned it into the breadbasket that it is for a large part of the South now. And you can't, for me, I couldn't drive around the South without thinking of the souls and the spirits of the millions and millions of people whose the sweat and blood of their backs had actually nurtured that soil. So I mean, I think that's a lot of what I think of, and that led directly to this project I'm working on now with the black men, the whole legacy of slavery in America, which is one of the most talked about and underappreciated, if you can once again hold that dichotomy in your head, aspects of the United States today.
Yeah. It's one of the really tantalizing things in the book because along with these family images and the things that you found in the attic and some pictures that you've taken, there's all of a sudden this new work. Well, new to me.
Yeah.
I hadn't seen it before. I hadn't seen any reproductions of it. And
yeah.
How far along is it, and where is it going,
pretty,
do you think?
I can't tell, but I think I have that. I think I might have a museum show of this stuff with that as the centerpiece. Yeah. Nice. So, yeah, I've got 40 of them.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about them.
Yeah. One of the things that I most took from and I'll conclude with this, and we can open up to questions from the audience. But one of the things that really resonated with me throughout the book was your story about the last time that you saw Cy Twombly, which is a quite sad moment, a quite haunting and memorable moment. And so if you'll forgive me, I want to read one more thing from your book. He's about to leave for Italy. He's just been visiting you, and he somehow knows. And you write, when we parted, I think we both knew that he was, as he laughingly remarked that day, closing down the bodega for real. Instead of turning his big back and flapping his usual fey goodbye wave as he got in the car, Cy turned back to face me, and he looked me directly in the eye. He said with discernible sadness and gravity, "You keep on working hard, sweetie." And on that note, I have to ask, now that everything is done with the book, now that you've put it out in the world, you just found out that I guess it's number 9 on the New York Times bestseller list.
Yes.
Which is very nice. What's next? What are you going to do next? You talk about this.
Now that's a hard question.
I know, but it's one that you've talked about before, that when you finish a project, you have to have another one underway.
Right. That's my ironclad rule.
So what's it going to be?
Well, I've got the black men, and there's some corollary bodies of work that go along with the black men. I've done a lot of work at the Dismal Swamp, the Great Dismal Swamp in Virginia, North Carolina. It straddles the border. That's the place that I'm interested in. Nat Turner and his rebellion. I'm really interested in the concepts of freedom that kept the slaves alive, mentally alive, and in maybe some cases physically alive. I'm not so interested in the hardships of slavery. We all know all about that. I'm just interested in what kept them alive, and so I'm photographing the rivers, because rivers were conversely the vehicle, or the way that the slaves were brought into America. Almost every one of them was brought in on our very own James River in Virginia. So, but they also were the most likely route to freedom, were rivers. So I'm photographing the rivers down in this one little section of southeastern Virginia, the rivers that lead to the Dismal Swamp, which is where slaves could go to escape the slave-chasing dogs and the people who were going after them for money, the slave catchers. And they formed whole communities in the Dismal Swamp. And I've been to those communities and watched them. They're now excavating them and figuring them out. So I'm fascinated by what concepts kept the slaves alive and hopeful. And it's photographically, that's a really difficult thing to do. Yeah. The rivers, the idea of rivers, but song is one of them, and I haven't quite figured out how to photograph song. Religion is one of them. The night sky was something that they would depend on. So I've gotten to the point now where I take pictures more in service of a concept rather than just for the sake of taking pictures, for how they're going to look. Although I'll do that too, but so I'm trying to work through this idea. It's a sort of rarefied and difficult concept, and finding the pictures to go with it is the difficult thing. But I'm making progress. I think I've got something.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Thanks. Thank you. That's good. Good questions. Yeah. You're going to stay up here with me, right? Okay. Thanks.
I assume that we've got some people that have some questions here in the audience. Just a reminder, if you do have a question and we call on you, please wait for the microphone to make its way to you. Okay, where do we start? All right.
There's someone right there.
There you go.
Hi.
Hi.
I just wanted to acknowledge something about the book. I saw an interview you did with Charlie Rose. And,
Oh, I haven't seen that yet. How is it okay?
Oh, it's great, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
No, there's the photo on page 427 of the man. You mentioned you couldn't see the maggots because they were blurred out.
Oh, yeah, right,
right.
right.
I just think I'm really excited to read the book, but I just noticed the diptych, and it's a beautiful comparison where you can see the details and the color.
Yeah.
And based on the black and white. So I just wanted to say that that's really exciting.
Oh, thank you.
Really
Yeah, I've got lots more I could show you.
Yeah, no, but I did have a question.
Yes.
Some of my friends just finished a day trip to meet their hero, Robert Frank, and growing up learning the history, my favorite photos were like Cunningham meeting Stieglitz or Steichen meeting Rodin, and I wanted to know if you had a story, maybe if you had a hero growing up, did you ever get to meet them, or did you want to? So I was wondering if there's any story you could talk about.
My daughter, Virginia, called me at 4:45 this morning because she'd forgotten that I was on Central Time because I was in Nashville. So at 4:45, I get this phone call from my daughter who's in Israel, and she said to me, she said, whatever you do on your tour, don't say to someone, that's a good question. Because that's just a stalling technique. And I said, thank you, darling, thank you. And I was like, but that's a good question. I have as recently as a month and a half ago written a fan letter to somebody. I wrote a fan letter to a man named Anthony Mara, who wrote a book called A Constellation of Vital Phenomenon. And I read it all. I have terrible insomnia. I read it all. I started reading it at maybe midnight, and I read it until 4:30 for 2 nights in a row, and then I started reading it again as soon as I was done. So I have so many people that I admire, and I wrote him this like adulatory fan letter, and he wrote me back and said, "Are you the Sally Mann?" I said, "Yeah," and he said, "Oh, I love your work too." So I mean, and the same thing. I have so many people that I when I meet them, like Ann Patchett, I go, "Oh my God, you're Ann Patchett! I just love your work. I'm such a fan." So yeah, I mean, I've got so many people that I admire, but I'm trying to think if there was one really. Ansel Adams, of course, back then. Yeah. I went to his workshop when I was maybe 19 or 20. And took his workshop, and then, he was such a flirt and everything, and he so he invited me back to be an assistant at his workshop, even though I knew nothing, like absolutely nothing. So I was an assistant at the Ansel Adams workshop. Who else is a big hero? I mean, I have so many heroes. Yeah, I'll have the answer by 3 in the morning, I promise. Yeah.
There's this book written by Will Stacy called Photographs Not Taken, where photographers recount photos that they couldn't take or wouldn't take. And I've always wondered, what was Sally Mann's photograph she couldn't take or wouldn't take?
Yeah, I think he asked me to be in that book.
I don't think you heard it.
Well, there's a story I tell in the book, which is, I guess, the most obvious one. When I had been teaching workshops for a couple of years, and I would exhort my students to take the pictures that are important, to take the pictures of the things that are in front of you. The dramatic scenes and the everyday scenes, the quotidian and the iconic. Take the picture, no matter what it is. Bring the camera to your face and take the picture. So when my son got hit by the car, and he was hit by a car going really fast, and he was thrown 52 feet. I don't know, it's in the book. And everyone thought he was dead. Everyone who saw it happen thought he was dead, and no one came over to his body but me, and I saw it happen, and I ran to his body, and he was lying in the right smack in the middle of the road, and we didn't have cell phones then, and I kept waiting for someone to call the first aid. I am answering your question. And no one called the first aid, so I ran back to the house, leaving him in the road, called, and it wasn't even 911, you just had to call the police department, and I ran back to him, and I sat there, and it was 11 minutes before the first aid got to him, and I thought about photography in those 11 minutes. And I thought, there is no way in the world I could ever take a picture. Even if iPhones had been invented and I had it in my pocket, I wouldn't have been able to take that picture. And there were some pictures of my father that I wanted to take as he was dying. I'm a big fan of Avedon and of Jim Goldberg, who both of whom photographed their fathers as they got old and declined and died. And I could not do it. I tried to, and then I found I couldn't do it. I guess I draw the line where where you are taking advantage of someone's dignity, where the dignity is really the issue. And my father was such a dignified, courtly man, and to take a picture of him in a state of even disrepair. I mean, he was always he was perfectly dressed. Even to take a picture of him when he was less than elegant would have been disrespectful. So I guess that's where I draw the line. Even though, and I talk about it, and I'll shut up about this, but I talk about it a little bit in the book. I have photographed my husband in ways that were, but this is a deal we have, and he understands. But yeah, I guess when dignity is involved, I'll draw the line. Personal dignity. Yes.
Hi. I guess my question is about the erotic, but we'll skip over the immediate family sort of thing
Okay.
and go into the later
I'm
work.
fine with that.
And not to, so as not to chew on old bone. And I get in your work these ruptures of the erotic from unexpected places. In the death photographs, there's an eroticism about death. In the photographs with the faces, there's an intimacy of gesture. There's to the close-up, to how close you are to the face. And in your landscape photographs, there's also an eroticism of place, of being somewhere.
That's a great line, an eroticism of place.
and
Write
being
that down. I'm writing it down.
Quote me.
I got a pencil. I always have a pencil. Thanks. You haven't copyrighted that or anything. I'm listening. Go ahead.
Now the question seems kind of banal. I guess, do you yourself, either in the intention of creating a photograph or in reflecting on photographs that have already been taken, what is sort of the erotic to you, if there is an erotic quality at all?
I'm not quite sure how to define. Does eroticism, here's the question, does eroticism always imply sexuality? I don't think it does, but...
I would say not sexuality, but sensuality.
There you go.
Yeah,
okay.
sensuality.
So as long as we've got our terms defined, yeah, I think we can go through with this. But yeah, I mean, if you substitute sensuality for eroticism in that question, then it's really easy. Then I think I have taken almost always sensual pictures or pictures that are weighted with sensuality. When you use the word eroticism, I tend to, I heard once someone, a first cousin to the eroticism of place, someone said the eroticism of parenthood. And what they meant by that was not what Terry Gross meant when she was trying to force me into admitting that I had eroticized my children. There's an eroticism of parenthood, too. It's about a parental carnality, a parental, I don't want to say lust because then you get into, again, so it's really, we're talking semantics here, but yeah, I mean, I guess if you want to do eroticism / sensualism, I would cop to that in almost everything I've done. Yeah, even including these new pictures of the black men. I mean, they are startlingly intimate, even though there's no, I mean, they don't bear any resemblance to like a Mapplethorpe picture. There's no sexual aspect to them at all. But yeah, a really good line. I hope you don't mind if I borrow it.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, thank you.
You know, what I always thought of when I thought of that question with your work, I thought about the swooning quality of them.
Swooning?
You know? Yeah, there's this stagger in them, and when you look at them, you're staggered. And that swooning quality, which is sometimes in the environment that you photograph in the landscapes,
right.
or in the, you know, the light in the hair in the photographs in Immediate Family or At 12. There's, to me, that's really always what it was, and you know, that's like a romance, an involvement in something that's profound and mysterious and absolute and obsessive, but not at all carnal from my perspective.
Right.
So anyway, I don't know if that word helps.
Yeah.
You could write it down.
Right.
But, there we go.
Yeah, write it down. This is how I wrote the entire book. Was, first of all, stealing from other people, of course, but yeah, a swoon.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Sally, I think you said that the act of taking someone's portrait has the potential of harming them, of hurting them, and I'm wondering how that works. How can that be?
Well, I will direct you to page like 421 of my book, because I go into a great deal of detail about this. And I steal my concepts, let me just say right off the bat, from a critic named Jim Lewis, who I just so respect in terms of his ideas about the fraught nature of portraiture. But it is such an ethically complex relationship between the photographer and the sitter. And that's one of the reasons I don't do portraiture very often, is that the photographer holds all the cards. Even Avedon once said, he said, oh, there are my subjects who are like professionals, who understand what the camera can do, and then they're the innocents. And most of us, you know, unless we're Paris Hilton, are the innocents. We don't really understand how the camera can abuse us. And it's very, very easy to do. And yeah, I try and be careful. It's easy to take a hurtful picture. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
hello. Thanks for coming.
Thanks.
I'm reminded, actually today at lunch I was talking about coming here and about some of your work, and it was interesting that one of the drinks that was served was a drink, Tropicana lemonade. So do you remember the little Tropicana, the character from the 50s and the 60s? She suffered the same fate.
I didn't have a television.
Oh, she was on the packaging. It was a little girl. It was a little girl, and her name was Tropicana, little Tropicana. She suffered the same kind of abuse that you were talking about earlier, that the eroticization of your children. That logo, that innocent logo of the little girl, was removed by the attitudes of small-minded people who objected to a little girl who had no top on. I mean, it's just
it was like the same with copper tone.
Exactly. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and the extremism of another logo that was suffered that kind of a fate was
a puritanical country.
The Procter & Gamble logo. There was a profile of a moon and 5 stars, and people said it was a symbol of witchcraft.
Oh God!
But so these were
it's
removed.
A crazy
so
country.
The point is that the power of those fanatics who object to these things, remove them from the consciousness or strip them away from our memory. But anyway, I just wanted to mention one other thing. There is a beautiful book that was published, I think it was in the 70s or the late 60s, by James Michener, called Iberia. The photography was not by the author, but it was a collaboration, and it was a beautifully produced book, as also where the photographs were intermingled with the text. I used that book as a guide when I was traveling in Spain.
Well, don't be telling people that. I just said that mine was the first one.
Well, yours is unique because your photographs and your text are yours.
Okay.
He collaborated with a photographer to produce that. Anyway, it's beautiful. But thank you very much
All
for
right.
the book,
Oh,
too.
you're welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. I think your book was one of the first photo books I ever bought, and so I've looked through it over and over and over again. So when we had our first son, we named him Emmett.
Oh, interesting.
2 M's, 2 T's.
Yeah, good.
I just wanted to know if the presence of your camera has ever been, like when you were taking pictures of your kids, if they resented the presence of the camera as something that took your attention away from them towards what you were working on.
I don't know. We'd probably have to ask them. If they haven't said that, it was there a lot. I mean, even sometimes at like Thanksgiving dinners and that kind of stuff. I don't know. I'll ask them and I'll get back to you on that. I really don't know. I'm not being coy.
One thing that you see in the documentaries that have been made about your work is that sometimes it looks like the camera is just there. It's sitting on the tripod. People are sitting around having a picnic.
Yeah.
It's there in case inspiration strikes, was how I took it.
Yeah.
Or it's there because a picture did happen, but then life went on.
Right.
Is that pretty characteristic?
Pretty much, yeah. It was just around.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, one of the risks, I think, of those family pictures was that the children, and I had one theatrical child, would start playing to the camera, right? And, and so then you have to ask the chicken or the egg, was she theatrical before the camera was always there, or after, or because the camera was always there? I mean, it hadn't hurt her to be theatrical. She's a very successful woman, but there's no way to know at this point how their lives would have been different without those pictures. I mean, well, they sure wouldn't have gone to boarding school. We know that much. Yeah.
I think we're going to allow one more question.
Okay.
Hi. People say I'm well-spoken. I'm terrified right now. They say you should never meet your heroes. Immediate Family was my first photo book. My parents graciously gave it to me as a child. They thought I was crazy. But it changed my life, and I feel like it's important to communicate that to you. It led me to photography. I came here maybe 10 years ago, and since then my work has enabled me to tour the world as well and share my own work, which focuses on the more complicated aspects of childhood. As a result, I think of a lot of your influence led me to my partner, changed the course of my life. And so this is one of those things where I get the opportunity to say thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. Thanks.
But also as an artist that often can't even afford your own work, and you have to come to terms with using other forms of currency, I hope that you'll take this currency, it's not monetary, just as honestly it really is, you changed the course of my life, and might not realize, maybe you do, that you have this effect on people. And so I just want to say thank you.
Oh, thank you. No, but I don't realize it. And people say, you probably hear this all the time, but I love your work. And I say to them, I don't hear it all the time. I live on a farm. No one says anything nice to me. And when I go to town, I go to the grocery shopping, they say, oh, you're Larry Mann's wife. I go, that's right, that's who I am. So thank you very much. Thank all of you. You were a great audience. Great, thanks. That's good. So, you sign books?
Yeah. I just want to say one last thing. Sally did, as she mentioned, she did actually come here to Ryerson many, many years ago, 1992, if you can believe that, which is when...
I got stopped at customs,
Oh, you did? What happened?
I had photographs, and because of the family pictures.
And you were bringing them here to show people?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I had a whole stack of 8x10s, and I was in customs for hours.
Well,
I was calling my lawyer.
Was anyone present that's in the room tonight?
Oh, really?
Fantastic. Thank you for coming back.
I can't believe you come back.
Thank you, Sally.
Oh,
that was
you're
great.
welcome. You're welcome. Thanks, guys. Thank Thank you so much.
And thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you for your patience. I know we were slow letting you in tonight. Please be careful on your way out. Those of you who do want